Okay, this is a genetics question requested by Alvin, and let's go right into it. So, um, I'm going to just read the question first. It says, suppose a female that's heterozygous for both PTP and ENA with this genotype here, which is big E, big P, little p, was unintentionally mated with a single F1 male of an unknown genotype from experiment 1. If 25% of the resulting F2 progeny died in the larval stage, the genotype of the F1 male was most likely, and we have a very, the different genotypes here. So, okay, they are talking about experiment 1 here. So I'm going to go to the passage here, and I'm going to read the experiment 1 part. By the way, I think that, you shouldn't be doing it like this in general. You should be reading the passage in its entirety before you do the questions. But for time's sake, I'm just going to go right into this experiment 1 part. So it says for experiment 1 that females homozygous for wild type ENA and heterozygous for PTP with the genotype little e, big P, little p, were crossed with males heterozygous for ENA and homozygous for wild type PTP. So they have the genotype E, or rather capital E, and then little p. So that would be the parent generation because males and females from the resulting F1 generation with the phenotype big E, big P, little p, were then selected and crossed with each other to produce an F2 generation. Flies with two mutant ENA alleles, big E, as well as flies with two mutant PTP alleles and at least one mutant ENA allele. So the genotypes could be big E, big P, or big E, big P, did not survive past the larval stage. Okay, so let's talk about what that means. So we have, anything that has big E, and anything that has big P, will not survive past the larval stage. Okay, so oops. So these die. Okay, now the question stem asks what happens if a female that has this genotype, big E, big P, was mated with some F1 male. So I'm going to start with that. I'm going to write down the female, big E, big P, little p. And this, is going to be mated by or with, so I'll write like female, and then some male from the F1 generation. Okay, so now let's see what the F1 generation can actually produce. So if we go back to where it says experiment 1 here, we see that in order to create the F1 generation, they crossed females with the genotype little e, big P, little p. So I'm going to write, so for the P1 or the P generation, we have little e, big P, little p, and they crossed it with males whose genotype is big E, little e, and big and little p, little p. So this would be crossed with big E, little p, little p. Again, this is the female, this is the male, and this will create the F1 generation. Now, dihybrid crosses could be pretty annoying, but the way that I prefer to do it is I write a Punnett square crossing like for here like the big E and the little e, and then I write a separate Punnett square for the p's. So I'll show you what I mean. So I can have, I'll use blue here. So for these, right, I'm going to cross them using a Punnett square. So this would give me big E, little e, little e, little e, big E, little e, little e, little e. And then for the P's, I'm going to use green to cross them. So this should give me big P, little p, little p, little p, which would give me big P, little p, little p, little p, big P, little p, little p, little p. Okay. So now I'm going to essentially distribute these to find all of the possible genotypes. So what I'm essentially going to do is I'm going to take this big E, little e, and I'm going to add on this, all 4 of these P genotype combinations. Okay, so we'll have big E, little e, and then for the P combinations, we have big P, little p, right? We also have little p, little p. And that's for that. So now next, I'm going to use the little e, and I'm going to, cross it with the different p's as well. So little e, big P, little p, little e, little e, little p, little p. So these are the possible genotypes of the F1 generation males. So genotypes of F1 males. Now, they tell us that, or over here, they tell us that males and females from the F1 generation with the genotype big E, little p, big E, little e, big P, little p, were crossed with each other to give the F2 generation. So one of them is going to have big E, little e, big P, little p as its genotype. And in the question stem, they're saying that, it's going to be mated with an F1 male. So that means that the F1 female is going to be the one with the big E, big P, little p genotype. So big E, big P, little p. And then for the female. And then we're going to have 4 possible options for the F1 males, which are these. So we can have big E, big P, little p. We can have big E, little p, little p. We can have little e, big P, little p, and lastly, little e, little e, little p, little p. Okay, these are the types. Whoops. Types of F1 males. Okay. Now, going back to this question here, they are saying that 20, so like as we cross these, it's going to give us an F2 generation, and they're saying that 25% of the F2 generation died during the larval phase or stage, which means that it must have these conditions, right? Either two big E's or two big P's, okay? Now, the choices that are given to us are big E, little p, little p. Oh, and then also, so they're asking for the genotype of the F1 male, right? And we know these are the possibilities for the genotype types of the F1 males. So, so if you look at the choices here, we can see or check if these choices are included in what we got for the F1 males. So the first one, big E, little p, little p, we have right, I will use purple. So this one, big E, little p, is this one. Okay. The next one, little e, big P, we actually do not have here. So this genotype does not exist in this F1 generation. Okay, next one is C, little p, little p. Do we have that? Yes, we do. We do have that. So that can be a possibility as well. Lastly, we have big E, big P. All right. Do we have that in our F1 males? We do not. We do not have that. So that one's out. So right away, our answer could be either choice A or choice D. So now what do we do? Well, so now I'm going to cross this F1 female with both of these F1 males. And then we can see if we're going to have 25% or, 1/4 die at the larval stage. So here I go. So I'm going to first do, so the female, big E, little e, and I'm going to do this one over here, which will be another big E, little e. And this gives me big E, big E, big E, little e, big E, little e, little e, little e. Okay, that's for the E's. Now, for the P's, I will have big P, little p from the female, and then little p from this male. So I'll get little p. So this would be big P, little p, little p, big P, little p, little p. Okay. Now, from this, we know, so maybe I'll write this in red. We know that, I'll write it here. Anything with big E, or big P will die during the larval stage, right? And what do we, how many do we get that have that? Well, we have this guy, big E, right? And the P's could be anything. So right away, this shows us that this will die. But I'm going to go over the last one as well, the little e, this one over here, just to show a comparison. So I'll do that in purple as well. So now I'm going to be crossing this F1 female with this F1 male. So big E, little, oops, little e. Let me fix that. Little e from the female, little e from the male. So big E, little e, little e, little e. Big E, little e, little e, little e. And then the female, big P, little p. And this male, little p, little p. So that's big P, little p, little p, little p. Big P, little p, little p, little p. Now, what are we looking for? We're looking for either big P, which we don't have here, or big E, which we don't have here either. So this cannot be the identity of the F1 male. So going back to this one, we have this, right? We don't have big P, but we do have big E. And this is 1/4 or 25% of the genotypes, right? And that means that that's the 25% that dies, during the larval stage. Therefore, our answer is big E, little p, which means our answer is A. So there you go. Hope this made sense. They have an explanation here that could also, I guess, help because you're kind of making a pedigree chart, and I'm kind of doing that here. But I think what I'm doing the most different is the dihybrid crosses. Because I'm not drawing, like 16 boxes, right? I'm just doing I'm doing a Punnett square for the 4 different combinations of the first part of the dihybrid, the E's, and then I'm doing another Punnett square for the second part of the dihybrid. So that gives me all the 16 as as well. It's just an easier way of doing it. So all right, hopefully this was helpful. And yep, that's it for that.